Everywhere belongs to me. Everywhere belongs to me. Everywhere belongs to me. Baby, you cannot save the world by talking. I cannot save the world with one day.
Power and more power, Simon. Hello, darling.
Hello.
Oh my God, we're in the dungeons of Amsterdam Museum.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
This is
instead
the most...
of partying, this time we're talking. And welcome.
I'm having the same tingles that I have when I go to party.
Really?
Yeah, it's like this excitement,
Yes,
of getting
course.
ready.
Yeah, there
It's
you go,
the most
baby.
I've been getting.
Yeah.
Kübra,
Yeah.
tell us who you are.
Yes, who am I? I'm tall, bald, non-binary trans person with tits, something like that.
Great introduction.
Yeah.
So I'm Simon, and I am a white person, blonde, kind of short hair, freckles. I'm wearing all black, just as you, Kübra.
And handsome every time.
Handsome every time, thank you. And I'm also having colored nail polish.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're glittering. Yeah, I love them. Look at them. Yeah. So, I mean, shall we cruise again together?
Let's cruise.
Then we start.
Great.
Hello, Renee.
Oh, now I have to pose, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
pose.
I cannot do that.
And again,
One
pose.
more. Okay. Perfect.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, change
So-
of roles.
We're changing positions. So, Cruising Gezi Park.
Yeah.
You've heard a little element of that in the song. Who made it? Tell us.
Çiçek Çocuk made it.
And it's basically some fragments from the Cruising Gezi Park, which is the work that Kübra and I, let me just go one more up, eye level, which is the work that we made together for the Refresh Amsterdam exhibition in the Amsterdam Museum, which is where we are at this moment, in the catacomb. And we made this in October 2020 in Gezi Park, which is one of the most famous parks, I guess, from Istanbul, because of the 2013 protests. The protests started both because the government wanted to construct a mall there, a shopping mall. And of course, people were saying like, oh, but we need to save this greenery. It was seen as a human rights question, right? Like, how do we resist against the government? But what was also very interesting is that it's not just human rights on the abstract level, but that it's also like embodied human rights in the sense that it's about the relationship to space. To the park, to what the park means for LGBT people. And Kübra and I started talking about when Kübra was like 15.
My years, like my memories, the memories and, like 3 different or 4 different, we can say, parts of my life, which shaped within Gezi Park also. So also the resistance itself during the protests, coming from the queer memory and queer resistance. So that's the importance for me, the work is.
Yeah, because there was in the 2013, there were the protests, but then in the 90s, Kübra went cruising there at night, right? So picking people up for sex. And we talked about these memories and kind of intertwined the memories around sex and the pleasure of meeting people and never meeting them again. The pleasure of finding dark corners, the pleasure of just having eye contact and then having a night together, as well as what happens now with the park, which is that there's a lot of lights put up, very bright lights. The trees are cut, so there's less dark corners, right? Less shadow, literally.
You're familiar with it, right? No,
we are very, yes. Because in the installation work, we combined it with The Oosterpark in Amsterdam, which has the same actually surveillance that is happening and the same cleaning of the city, right? This question of cutting bushes and shrubs, and also really placing lights. In 2017, somebody who was cruising was killed in Amsterdam, Oosterpark, and the police responded by saying like, "Oh, but we want to protect you, so let us put up lights." And of course, the cruising community said like, "No, actually, we don't want lights, because that's taking away the pleasures that we're coming here to see."
We don't like to be protected, yani.
Not by police.
Not by police, yeah.
Yeah. So that is Cruising Gezi Park.
Yeah.
And then today is an amazing day, at least I think so, because you are here and we have some amazing guests and we have Kübra here. And we call it the architecture of sex. That's how this symposium is titled. And it comes from a title from Paul Preciado's essay. I'll just hold it up. Like this. Paul Preciado's essay. And in a way, the way that Cruising Gezi Park as a work touches on so many different subjects in terms of the construction of safety, like who decides what safety means? How is safety implemented, or how is safety or an idea of safety forced upon through certain materials, such as light, right? Or such as taking away the trees, and how does this also intertwine with ecological questions, for example, as well as question of bodily freedom. What does this even mean? What does intimacy mean? If you're not thinking from this nuclear family perspective, something that Sophie Lewis later will talk upon as one of our guests, if it's not that the nuclear family creates your intimacies, like what do your intimacies then look like? And these are questions that are also all coming in this essay in so many varied ways. And because Preciado's work has a sort of like very deeply entangled and widespread way of entering many themes, that for me felt like an inspiration for this symposium. And to give you a little bit about the architecture of sex. So when I say sex, we could also say the architecture of intimacy, for example, and one inspiration really is Saidiya Hartman's Saidiya Hartman, yeah, I was like, did I say her last name? Yeah, Saidiya Hartman, her book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, where she's describing the intimacies of Black women around the 1900s in North America, in the cities mostly. And she's describing the way that policing is influencing their intimacies, how they are often criminalized if they have queer intimacies or interracial intimacies or intergenerational intimacies. And often they are portrayed as sex workers and then criminalized by that. So she talks about that, but one part of the book also talks about the ways that buildings and the buildings that you're assigned to or the homes that you have access to, they create the intimacy, right? Because if your walls are very thin and you're living with, maybe you're living in a couple situation, but you're hearing the couple next door, then there's already something, like there's an overflow happening, right? The sound is creating something like an intimacy, but perhaps, or an annoyance, like not to romanticize it. She's also talking about the way that dark corners in buildings, like apartment buildings, are on one point surveilled. So again, we have those dark corners that are taken away.
Can I have a look at this beautiful book, Darren?
You can,
Thank
it's
you.
heavy. And I think maybe one more example is from Jackie Wang, when she talks about incarceration and imprisonment, where prison buildings are, of course, known for their panopticon architecture. So this idea that the guard can see everyone at the same time, but you're never sure if the guard is watching you. So you're internalizing the eyes, right? The gaze of the guards. You're internalizing the policing. This is kind of a known sort of concept, I guess, the panopticon. But the way that Jackie Wang also describes it is that the sort of high up windows in prison cells are seen as the eye of God. So light is coming in, and it's not just for that people cannot, like look out, but it's also that the light coming from above is associated with the eye of God. So here you see how architecture sort of creates this idea, right? When it creates an idea of presence or intimacy or surveillance, and how these intertwine and entangle. So that's just as an introduction to the themes of today. But Paul Preciado's essay, The Architecture of Sex, also points to the fact that architecture is not necessarily material like hard material, right? That's what we associate with architecture, is like these kind of shapes. As the catacomb that we're in, it's like, oh yeah, obviously architecture. But Paul Preciado talks also about the architecture, for example, of the contraceptive pill. And the way that this is developed, but also the packaging of the pill, and how the packaging of the pill reminds you every day that you should be taking it, which, according to Paul Preciado, implies that there's a kind of forgetfulness of the person using that pill, which are often seen, of course, as women. And of course, women are forgetful. We cannot trust their memory. We cannot trust anyway their rational capacity. So the packaging of the pill is nicely designed to continuously remind of that idea or that portrayal of what a woman is and what she should be. And I think that the contraceptive pill immediately reminds us that architecture is not necessarily, it's not necessarily the hard shapes or the shapes that we imagine when we're looking at architecture, but it's also the technologies that we might swallow. It might be the fluid technologies. And all of these themes will, in one way or another, come forward in our amazing guests' talks, sharings. And I think this is a perfect moment to introduce our first speaker, Tracy and Miko. So our first speaker, and I'm super excited that she's here, is Tracy and Miko. We first met each other at a writing camp where Tracy Ann hosted a workshop which was around conversation. And she literally had a conversation with Linnea Denise, a DJ, in this workshop. And it was really about showing, at least this is how I interpreted it, how knowledge can be produced in many different forms, right? Like also through conversation. It does not have to be this one-way talk where you're talking to an audience, and how much can happen in conversation, and also how embodied conversation is. So when I said that architecture can be fluid, and maybe also referring to Saidiya Hartman, architecture can also be sound, right? I think this is something that really came forward in Tracy Ann's workshop when we first met. Tracy Ann Mikkel is also the coordinator, now I'm going to look at my notes, of the Unsettling Program, a program for radical inclusivity at the Rietveld Academie and the Sandburg Institute, which is in Amsterdam.
Power of pussy. The power of pussy. The power of pussy. The power of pussy. The power of Lord God. Back it up, then over, gal a go on bad. Him buy her the Birkin handbag. Then she left him. Blood clot the dark mad. Power of pussy. Jesus. When gal can please man dream lad. Gunman transform in a deacon. Look at you get some and turn real man. Power of pussy. Marvelous. Bring out the anger and the calm in us. In a one pum pum boy put all the trust. In a the rubbish bin a him and a dog a cuss.
Hello dear, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. That was great.
Yeah.
I get what Simon was saying earlier about feeling like, oh, you're kind of at a party. Mm-hmm. Like it's been a while since I've danced with someone.
You should.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And maybe I just wanted to start off now to show the video. because I wanted to kind of talk about, how I am moving through Amsterdam, moving through Jamaica, moving through Kingston in Jamaica. And let's watch a video first to show that.
Power of pussy. The power of pussy. The power of pussy. The power of pussy. The power of Lord God, back it up, then over, gal a go on bad. Him buy her the Birkin handbag. Then she left him. Blood clot the dark mad. Power of pussy. Jesus, when gal can please man, dream lad. Gunman transform in a deacon. Look at you get some Anton real man. Power of pussy, marvelous. Bring out the anger and the calm in us. In a one pum pum boy put all the trust. In a the rubbish bin a him and a dog a cuss. Power of pussy, change your life. Power of pussy, make you wise. Power of pussy, make you love your side chick. And the power of pussy, make you hate your wife. Then over again. Power of pussy. Powerful. Powerful.
Side pussy of power.
Powerful. Powerful.
Pussy of power.
Powerful. Powerful.
Side pussy of power.
Powerful.
Pussy of power.
Pussy buy house and buy girl car. Then gabbo, the pussy start world war. Yo, if she get wet, don't hurt her. We are gonna beat you and put it on world star. Power, powerful and expensive. Sugar daddy take care of expenses. Power, man clip extended. Shoot up a house and best friend live. Power, like the ark carry Noah. Powerful.
Side pussy of power.
Powerful. Powerful.
Pussy of power.
Powerful. Powerful.
Side pussy of power.
Powerful. Powerful.
Pussy of power.
A lot of us underestimate like the power of the vagina, right? It's like a very powerful tool. You mean? I mean, it's so powerful, you know what I mean? Like crazy. Like a lot of guys like lie, like girls don't drive them crazy. But trust me, like girls' vagina drive a lot of guys crazy, man. The power of the vagina. I love all ladies, alright? Yes, the power of the vagina. Yes.
Power of vagina, power of pussy, dear Tracy.
Yeah.
I love your outfit, the colors, the Jamaican. Can you tell me about your
Yeah.
outfit and yourself?
Yeah, let me give a description to just what I am. So I am a black woman. I have long dreadlocks, and I am wearing a Jamaican South African designer collaboration that I bought when I was in Jamaica this past Christmas. And it's a top that has a sort of like glittery, satiny sheer, and it's with the colors that are really associated with Jamaica: red, yellow, green.
Yeah.
And we're in jeans, sitting on the stairs, ready to have a chat. And thanks, Simone, for the introduction and also bringing in when we first met, because this is the way in which I really like to be able to talk, which is really a conversation. And this invitation really gave me the chance to think through kind of what it's like for me to move through the cities in which I have lived most in my adult life. Those cities are Kingston in Jamaica, where I'm from. Well, I'm not from Kingston, I'm from Mandeville in Jamaica, but Jamaica where I'm from. And Amsterdam here in the Netherlands, where I've lived for 7 years now. And oddly enough, I think maybe if you added up every single day, it would be equal in both cities. But in terms of my sort of full residence or what's on paper, Amsterdam is the city that I've lived the longest in my adulthood. So far, and whenever I think that, I always feel a sense of kind of sadness, actually, which I mean, you'll probably see why as I kind of talk a little bit more. Also now officially Dutch, and for a while, I mean, so there's also something about like, what does it mean to, I'm living in a city where I'm also kind of, have all the rights to be in what is considered to be full citizenship rights. So there is also that aspect of it as well. while, of course, yeah, feeling quite immigrant. But yeah, I wanted to kind of talk a bit about this video, the video that you saw, which I sort of put together 2 cell phone footage of Jamaica, or Kingston, Jamaica, and then Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And the idea came to me with this song because I was driving, and if you don't mind putting up, yeah, for Jamaica, I was driving. When I was in Jamaica, I have to drive. That's the way in which I get along in the city, get around the city. And when I was driving my brother's van, and he had a CD in it with like just dancehall music, Jamaican dancehall music. And then the song came on, and I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. I love this song. Like, for it to just be like straight out the power of pussy. And, you know, this song, of course, it's super hetero, but it's this song with this, you know, this guy, this dancehall artist just saying, hey, like, let's just talk about the fact that, like, a woman's vagina is something that can bring men to their knees. Like, let's talk about this, you know, and like, let's put it in a song. And I was just my mind was blown, one, that the song existed. I love that. And then the next part was just me sort of like, then just like loving and blasting the song as I just kind of went through the city. And it was this, I was going to see my friend, you know, of course it's always sunny. So you're kind of in this situation where I'm just kind of like, driving my brother's van, just going across the city, actually the same, the similar route to what's kind of shown here because I didn't video it immediately. And just kind of just going through, driving, overtaking cars, you know, of course you're in traffic sometimes, you know, the windows are up, you know, you just sort of just blasting the music, going through the city. And it gave this feel of just, there's this freedom, there's this joy, there's also this just sense of just, yeah, this is, it's amazing to be in Jamaica as a Jamaican. Like, it kind of gave me this feeling of like, I love my country. I love the sort of way in which we can have this music form that can in some sense be super misogynistic, and then in another sense can be just very affirming sexually for us as women. And what does it mean to really just kind of just go with that and sink into that, and just, it's kind of like biting like into this really juicy peach or something as you're going through the city. It was just amazing. And I kind of repeated the song like maybe 4 times as I was going through, you know, and so I kind of wanted to just think through that feeling and how that feeling you know, what does it mean? I mean, there are certain things that kind of let me kind of, before I'm trying to not get too intellectual about it yet, so I'm just talking about how I feel, and then jump to how I feel in Amsterdam. For Amsterdam, you know, like when I'm also going through the city, then I'm riding on a bike, of course, which I love. I actually fucking love riding on a bike. I mean, if I had to choose driving or biking, I'd choose biking. And there's also something, which is what I'm also glad that I could capture the video, that the weather finally decided to do the right thing. So that I could kind of capture the video also of what it means to also be on the canals in Amsterdam, biking in the sun. It's like a fairy tale, right? Like, it's just, you know, you're also just sort of like there going through, and you also just feel like, oh, everything is like, this is great. It's just like, sun is great out. You know, everyone's just chilling. It's leisure. You know, there's this sense of also joy as I'm going through and I'm listening to the music. But there isn't this sense of like, oh, I'm Jamaican in Jamaica, feeling this sort of like affirming sort of music, this music that affirms my sort of like way of expressing myself sexually, right? There's not that. In fact, then it starts to be a little bit more the opposite. This idea that I feel great, but I think I feel great in a sense of like in a position to what's happening around me. So at the same time that I'm really enjoying the canals, I also understand what the presence of the canals mean. I understand in some sense how people are on the canals and what they see when they see me. So like I'm thinking about what I'm seeing and how that affects me, right? So it's beauty on one hand, but then it's also a sort of beauty that has a history that has always not only sort of alienating me, but deliberately oppressing me. If I sort of look on the historical aspects of it, And then, so there's a way in which I don't have that connection, I think, to the city that I've lived in for 7 years. In the same way which I have this connection, of course, in some sense, of course, home may always be home. So maybe that's understandable with Kingston. So yes, I'm biking through and just sort of like thinking, you know, I enjoy sort of like dancing, you know, like even today I was like, let me listen to this again and think about how I feel coming through, you know, the Nahan stretches because I live close by. And, you know, and just sort of like, you know, this loving and moving and dancing, but then of course just having this awareness that people maybe also be looking at me and thinking, who's that crazy girl like moving on her bike? Sometimes I do like a little like, trying to do like a little twerk thing, you know, like you're on the bike and you're like, because you're getting into the music and you're just kind of like feeling it, but you get the sense that this is not the norm and you aren't the norm. And in fact, on that note, like I wanted this idea of you aren't the norm. I brought this book from Kai Miller, his most recent book, Things I've Withheld. And there's a passage in it that when I read it, I cried. And the reason I did was that, you know, he describes like this moment of being in an airport and being strip searched. And there's a moment that he said, they sit, 3 men in uniform, and silently observe my body. And suddenly, this does not surprise me either. And then later down, he talked about the fact that, yeah, these officials who have the power to stop me, who have the power to order me into a small room, who have the power to order me to take off all my clothes, have done that. They have ordered me to strip, and they do nothing more than observe my body for a minute or 2. And then they tell me to put my clothes back on and leave. And when Simone was talking about this idea of surveillance and architecture and thinking about surveillance and the city, one of the things about Amsterdam that I think I always find very interesting is the fact that the same beauty of the canals and the sort of quaintness of this sort of World Heritage, site is also leads to the possibility of a lot of surveillance. The same amazing way in which you can be on the bike and move through the city also leads to a lot of face-to-face contact, a lot of surveillance as possible. And I mean, I know this is something persons talk about in relationship to Amsterdam and the village-like nature of the city. And for me, I feel this, right? I feel this idea of this observation, and not only the observation, but also the entitlement to this observation as I move through the city, as I think, and I think when I just, not to necessarily have to be so, about always just relating it to the materiality, but I think the materiality does have a contribution here, right? If you think about, if I'm in Jamaica, I'm driving in my own vehicle, you can see the roads are wider in this part of Kingston. You're sort of just moving through in a way that people are looking, people also care, and people also, in Jamaica we'd say them fast, meaning that people are inquisitive, of course, but there's a way in which you're not able to observe so directly, observe so obviously, in Jamaica on a wide street where you're moving faster, versus on a bicycle where everyone can see you so clearly and able to kind of look at you in the eye with the expression on their face. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm curious. Yeah, for me, it's kind of like, yeah, if I think about like the power of myself, the power of belonging, the power of freedom, the power even, of course, of sexual freedom. In terms of, when I say sexual, in terms of just like within my body and how I feel and how I express myself in that way in both cities, it's something that I really kind of enjoyed thinking through, using this song, using my experience of transportation in the city. And and thank you for the chance to kind of think through that. And it will be a continuous sort of exploration. So I appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks.
Do you want to do a little?
Shall we play again? I love it. I cannot stop, listen. Since today I just take the song.
Is there something, maybe a question that you would have already?
Yes, yeah. Do I ask it now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I was wondering, do you sort of also listen very often to like Jamaican music, to dancehall music specifically in the Netherlands, to sort of soften the experience, which can be quite sort of horroring, maybe seeing these sort of imperial buildings surrounding you?
Yeah, no, it's a good one, and I'm glad you asked it, because I was also thinking that this morning, that yeah, I think there is some way in which this sort of reclaiming of myself happens a lot through music here as I sort of as I bike in the city. So yeah, it's Afrobeat, dancehall, I think are the two kinds of music I enjoy listening to most, and sometimes belting it out loud. You know, maybe not like when I'm going down Nahan Strategies, but maybe like in Vondelpark, you know, like this kind of thing where I'm going fast enough that I'm like, okay, they may hear me, but by the time they realize who it is, I'm gone, you know. But yeah, I do that, and I think it connects me with myself. But at the same time, I think what can be difficult is that connection to myself feels like a disconnection from the city. So that's the kind of...
Yeah. Thank you for your honesty. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, let me try not to comment because anyway, I just want to embrace with words what you're saying also about this connection and like affective relationality that comes through the music, but then also the disconnect in space, right? But there was something that also reminded me when we're thinking about this observation, right? And like being in a city that oozes whiteness and colonial history, it made me think also of that during the COVID period, right, when everything was still very much locked down, a lot of trans people, or like visibly trans people, would feel, for example, in one way or another, rested, right, from this continuous gaze the moment that you walk the street. And I was wondering if that is something for you that you felt as well, like speaking about the car, right, where you have like a frame around you in a way. Did you experience something similar like that during the COVID period, or how did your relationship to public space also change through that, maybe?
Yeah, no, I love that too, because I think for me that question is also about when I'm walking as well versus when I'm biking too, because I think I think when I'm walking in the city, which I also do quite a lot, and which I did a lot during COVID, which is why walking comes to mind. During the first lockdown, let's say that, because it's still here. I feel more of a connection because I think, and I think for me, because these are questions that I'm going through a lot in terms of what does it mean? Do I belong here? Do I want to stay here? These kind of things are questions that I ask myself a lot. And there is a sense of peace that I sometimes have when I'm just walking along the canals. When I wake up in the morning, and the beauty then comes. The beauty then gives me this sense of calm and peace. And I think the difference there is one, it's like, yeah, there are less people. And so I think then I can sort of like form my own relationship then to the beauty, to the nature. I probably, the buildings matter and may not matter as much then. I think I then turn my attention more so to the water than to kind of looking up or looking around at people. And I'm thinking through all of this as I answer you now, but that's when I then think, oh, this is why I like living here sometimes, you know, so it's good to kind of think through both of these questions because it does for me answer the ways in which the exact same architecture can both make me feel like a sense of like peace and at the same sense, a sense of disconnection. And I'm hoping that at some point it could also make me feel a sense of belonging. That hasn't come yet, but we'll see, yeah. Or if that never comes, that's also fine with me. Then I'll also just leave.
I was wondering if you decide to stay on for a longer time, and you also would become in a position in power to maybe change the city. Like, what would for you be the most important thing to change in this outlook and on these canals in a way that it would make you feel more welcomed and more yours also?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I've done already is with a group of persons. We co-founded the Amsterdam Black Women Meetup. And part of this was to also respond to the overwhelming whiteness of the city, especially in the inner city, you know, like kind of just in what's considered to be the wealthier parts of Amsterdam. And you know, and how it is that we would have brunch in places that, you know, normally when people step in and they see like 10 Black women, they're like, you know, kind of this, not necessarily like afraid, but more so just shocked because that they never see that, you know. So I think having, and the reason I brought that up is that I think having space for people who actually very much engage with Amsterdam or with inside the ring of Amsterdam. They live their lives here, they do things here. But how many spaces do you have for them where they feel like, okay, this is for me, this is where I belong, this is where my sort of social needs are prioritized. So I think that's what I want more. Like there needs to be, I think for a city of Amsterdam, like Amsterdam, which considers itself to be an important city in the world, there's very little space for, and this is sort of like leisure space, gathering space for people of color that just feels like, yeah, I'm gonna go to this bar and this is the bar where I know if I step in, I'm gonna see like 10 cool Black folk, you know? Where's that in the sort of inner city? Not many places, or maybe, some persons would say none, some persons would say not many, but there definitely needs to be more. So that's how I would sort of have more of these spaces in the city. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're gonna continue in Amsterdam and what's happening in Amsterdam and how the streets are talking to the people, shaping people's behavior, etc. with our beautiful next speaker, René Boer. René Boer is an organizer with the Field Architecture Collective. And I'll start again where we first met, I think, René and I, which was when René was hosting a gentrification walk through the Spaarndammer buurt. And they showed all the mechanisms of gentrification happening in this neighborhood. And I specifically remember where there was the labor, I should say that the city provided houses to labor class people where it was like a project itself. And one of the elements that was part of like getting this kind of housing was that the women were not allowed to hang outside of their window and talk to each other. So again, we see this policing also of noise, right? Because that would be like unsuitable or something like that. So we met at the gentrification walk, and then I saw René speak at the Kootwijk, Radio Kootwijk, which is somewhere in the Netherlands. And this is like a Dutch colonial heritage because it's the radio station that they made around 1900s so that they could have an independent connection with what was called then the Dutch East Indies. And they wanted to have their own communication connection. So they made this radio station. And then nowadays, this is like a site of leisure, right? As Tracy-Ann was referring to this idea of leisure, which is heavily sort of celebrated, I think, in the Netherlands, where, for example, also you could have your wedding. And René showed beautiful pictures, images of weddings, and of course, relating that to the colonial history of this place. Recently, Field Architecture has also initiated swarming the city in the red light district, really taking up space while being COVID safe, dancing on the streets, but with a distance. I was part of one of those swarmings and the police immediately came. So that's an introduction to René, also to Amsterdam, I guess. Without further ado, Smooth City is what René Boer is going to be talking about.
Spinderella, put it up one time.
Come on.
talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that make me. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk.
Welcome, Ronnie.
Thank
Welcome,
you,
darling.
thank you, thank you.
Would you like to describe yourself?
Yeah, I'm a guy with a white guy with blonde hair. I was born here in Amsterdam, not far from here actually. Yeah, that's me.
So welcome to Cities with Life, Civil Sex.
Yeah, exactly.
We are on you.
Yeah. So today I will take you all to an imaginary city where you've all already been. Upon arrival, you immediately notice how everything is like soft and smooth, finished and apparently perfect. Buildings are in an excellent condition. They're new, renovated and well maintained. Public spaces are high quality, clean, clearly controlled, well designed and also well maintained. Anything you might want to do has already been predicted and prescripted. Everything is designed to stimulate consumption. Every inch is under the control and conforming to capital, power structures and social cultural norms. Everything looks the same. And everywhere you look, new technologies create seamless on-demand services. As far as you can see, there are no voids, empty lands or vacant properties. There are no aberrations, there's no abnormalities, no confrontations, frictions or tensions. There are no layers from the past, traces from others or references to elsewhere. No alternative narratives seem to have made a successful claim on urban space unless they're neatly encapsulated in the wall. Nothing is in the process of becoming something. Everything is already ready. Welcome to the smooth city. You've probably recognized it. It's not an existing city, but it's an urban condition that's on the rise almost everywhere, in particular here in Amsterdam. And I'm showing you an image of Oosterpark, a new development in Amsterdam Oost featuring an empty public space and two towers. And I think the smooth city is something that is clearly redefining how people understand the urban, but also how people live together in cities and also how people have sex. And the smooth city is nothing new. Already in 15th century Florence, the elite was annoyed about like mingling with ordinary dirty people on the only bridge connecting the two banks of the city. So they ordered the construction of another layer on top of the bridge. And I'm showing you an image of the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. But later in 19th century Paris, the authorities asked Baron Haussmann to create new straight boulevards cutting right through the messy urban quarters where the regular people would live. Creating new spaces for consumption, but also allowing military police to drive around and control the city more easily. And after the Second World War, there was like a change in direction in the sense that people were actually escaping the crumbling and dilapidated ruined cities after the war and trying to go into, let's say, these suburban areas, trying to escape the unsmooth cities, all the while solidifying patriarchal norms in these suburban areas. But in recent times, this quest for smoothness has moved back into the city across the world. I'm showing you an image of Venice, where the historical area has been slowly turning into some kind of shopping mall with still some historical elements left here and there. I would like to give you a bit of a sense where this smooth city comes from and what are the forces that are driving the smooth city. And first of all, I think it's the rise and current hegemony of neoliberal urbanism. So the neoliberal thinking on city. And there's a lot to say about this, but maybe some elements are the privatization of housing and services and the commodification of space. And secondly, I think there's a wider cultural turn towards control, conformism and the polished spectacle. Everybody being addicted to Netflix every single night. And another very important cultural turn, I think, is the return of the middle and upper class to the city. So rather than actually going to the suburbs or into the countryside, they're en masse moving back to the city, creating a lot of pressure on the city. And of course, this is also happening and impacting in Amsterdam. So we see the neoliberal restructuring of the city, the massive sale of social housing, promoting as the city as a brand, I Amsterdam. There's this renewed interest in Amsterdam. There's an influx, mostly an influx of well-to-do people, bringing tourists, for example, but also expats, also people from the rest of the Netherlands with a lot of money, and also bringing with them like a homogeneous consumer culture. And this also relates to a growth in the number of hotel rooms, in Airbnbs, upmarket shops and restaurants, and all the voids are being filled in. All buildings have by now been renovated. All public space has been upgraded. There's zero tolerance towards street art, graffiti, unwanted elements such as drug dealers or the homeless. There's zero tolerance towards squatting or alternative lifestyles. We also see the proliferation of CCTV, preventive police being reintroduced at the moment. There are large-scale beautification plans, such as the Rode Loper or the upgrading of the red light district. I will say a bit more about that later. So, according to some, Amsterdam has never looked so beautiful. And of course, I think this is something that we're now touching on the paradox of the smooth city. We all need a city that is clean enough, safe enough, that somebody has put some love in actually maintaining it, as a city that functions well enough. And of course, this is very important for people also with different abilities. They need like some smoothness to move around in the city. But I think the paradox is there's also another side to this story, and that the smooth city is also problematic in many ways. And I will give you a few examples on why I think the smooth city is very problematic. So first of all, I think the smooth city flattens all urban complexity into a one-dimensional story. There's only one story left, and in Amsterdam is that we're a successful city. And it's dominated by one set of norms, mostly wealthy and white ones. And it's only allowing for one kind of use, following the polished script through the city that turns every action also into a transaction. I think it's also very undemocratic, the smooth city. There's literally no space left for multiple voices, ways of life, ways of expressing or imagining alternatives, unless you are really rich. So only if you can afford it, your ideas are going to be reflected in urban space. Then it's also very inaccessible for those who can't or won't live up to the strict norms imposed by the smooth city. And this can be very subtle. And in a sense, I'm really inspired by the work of feminist Sarah Ahmed in this sense. And she describes very well how bodies amplifying certain norms will inscribe these norms on a space, which will then allow other bodies to be extended in that space or not, of course. So different bodies also navigate the smooth city differently. And the last point is harder to describe. And I'm just using a quote from a dystopian novel, Brave New World, in which this character, John, says to the character that is the controller, and he says, like, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. And I'm just using this quote trying to say that people are not robots following a script. People actually have a soul. People also need spontaneity, fiction, friction, transgression. People have desires and they also want to challenge norms now and then. People want to feel space and people want to feel time. And I think that is getting harder and harder in the smooth city. And the smooth city is also impacting our lives in many ways. People internalize the norms of the smooth city. So people increasingly demand efficiency, perfection, beauty, wholeness. So also what does it do to our sense of becoming? And I'm just going to give you a few examples. So it also impacts the design of the self and curated self-promotion online. That is, I think, one example. I'm showing you an image of my colleague, Mark Minkjan. I hope he doesn't mind playing around with some face adjustment app to try to see how that works. But also, for example, the rise of self-care and the self-help industry, of course. And I'm showing you an image of an $8 drink that you can buy in New York that allows you, according to the can, to stay calm, cool, and collected. And of course, the rise of convenience culture. Just walk out. I'm showing you an image of an Amazon new supermarket that allows you to do just walk out shopping without actually interacting with a human cashier. And then there is this focus on control. I'm showing you an image of an advertising for Google Nest, showing this like interior in pastel colors with the Google Nest appliance and a lot of cameras, of course, some millennial mint objects here and there. And clearly showing how this is integrating in our lives. There is no, in the smooth city, there is no opacity, there is no hideouts, there is no inwardness, everything is already in the cloud. And of course, there's the comfort of bubbles. Showing you an image of a person with noise-canceling headphone completely by themselves. And of course, there's the comfort of homogeneous bubbles, where you can only meet the same people, which are becoming more and more dominant across the city. I'm showing you an image of a certain space in Amsterdam North that is often praised, but I think is an homogeneous enclave in a changing neighborhood. And of course, also, the smooth city shapes people's lives, and it then also shapes people's sex lives, of course. I'm trying to, I thought of a few ways how I think that is currently happening. And first of all, I think there's less and less space for non-normative sexualities. And it has been more than 10 years ago, we started a festival called Queerstan here in Amsterdam, that now has a different name. And we could use this, this generous space next to Leidseplein. It was a large squatted space, it has a large theater. We could organize debates and parties and performances and sex parties in that space. And it was next to Leidseplein, and we didn't have to pay anything for that. So the city still had that space to breathe and allow that non-normative sexualities to express themselves in the middle of the city. Same goes for housing. A lot of queers are still marginalized or increasingly marginalized, having a harder time to access the housing market in the city, and also slowly being put back to the fringes or even outside of the city. So how are you going to meet each other on the street or in a bar if you're all being pushed out at the same time? Secondly, I think the firm establishment of like homogeneous culture and surveillance in the city make also public space less and less accessible for non-normative sexualities in many ways, just to be there, but also to express yourself, but even also to have sex in some of the dark corners that were mentioned before. And the third, I think, is a very important dimension. The smooth city demands hard work. To survive in the smooth city and to afford a smooth city, you need to spend a lot of time. It also demands, therefore, stability and predictability, so maybe also, therefore, monogamy. So there is, in the smooth city, people have less and less time and space to explore themselves, explore their boundaries, explore what else they want to do, and to transgress these boundaries, and maybe there's no time to lead a rough life or to cheat. So what I think is happening, that what the last bit of sex that was still in the public domain in the smooth city, or in the smooth city of Amsterdam, is quickly moving or being relegated to the bedroom. So there's no more cruising on Leidsestraat happening. There's no more sex workers picking up clients behind Central Station. There's no more sex in the woods at Nieuwemeer. Even this designated cruising area appointed by the municipality is now slated to become fancy housing soon. There are no more dark rooms, and the legendary gay club or queer club, Club It, will become a museum this summer. Or another interesting example, especially when we're talking about the architecture of sex, I'm showing you an image of a tipple zone in just outside in the harbor of Amsterdam. Yeah, this kind of area where people could come in cars, pick up someone, and drive into these like walled-off spaces to have sex in the car and then drive off again. And I really don't want to romanticize also this kind of places and the lives that people have in these places. But I think this also has disappeared, and it's another element of the fact that sex is really moving out of being moved out of the public domain in all its. Yeah, I think it was closed in the early 2000s. So this is probably from the mid-90s. Yeah, and this is another interesting example, is the Milkshake Festival that is happening until Corona every year in Oosterpark. And what for me has been really frustrating here is also that this has been really embraced by, let's say, the gay or queer culture in Amsterdam. And as you can see, I'm showing you an image of the Milkshake Festival taking place, and the photo is taken a bit from a distance, and you see how the Milkshake Festival is fenced off. So there is like fences around it, even with like black plastic around it to make sure you can't look through. And so people had to pay, I think, 60, 70 or 80 euro to get in, and then you have also to confirm to the consumption that they offer, of course. And it's clearly fenced off from the public domain. So like sexualities can be expressed as long as there's this fence around it. And of course, also the rise of the smooth city fits perfectly with the ongoing rise of dating apps, efficient and controlled and even pre-planned hookups. And it's, of course, resonates with the demand for perfection. There is no time to have a failed date. We need to have a perfect date in the one time slot that we have. Of course, and I mean, there's more extreme examples, and I can go on and on, but I also like this one. Is I'm showing you an image of an advertising by the Gatebox company offering a virtual girlfriend, and you see a person sitting on a couch, sipping a drink, having a good night out with the virtual girlfriend in this Technopod hologram thing next to the person. And of course, Corona is yet another dimension, escalating all these kind of developments. So everybody being isolated at home, strict evening curfews, and as noticed by many large porn providers, a spike in porn consumption throughout from March last year onwards. So if the last bit of sex in the public domain is shifting to the bedroom, we also have to acknowledge that in the expensive, increasingly expensive, smooth city, many people have to live with their parents, their partners, their ex-partners, or their housemates, and which is also drastically shape the liberties people have in their life, and it's drastically shaping people's sex life, therefore. And I think also one quote by Paul Preciado is really beautiful here. And that is from the essay Architecture of Sex as well. And that is, architecture is a performative technique. It produces the subject it claims to shelter. So also the architecture also produces the sexuality of a subject. And I'm again showing you the images from Amsterdam Oost, this Oostpoort development. And I wonder, what is the kind of sex that is taking place in this building? To close off, I would like to take you to the red light district, or the Wallen, as they're locally known. Well-known area, the historic center of Amsterdam, which has a long history of sex work. And I'm showing you an image of the Oude Kerksplein with the sex workers standing in the window in the mid-60s, with some people looking what's happening there. And until Corona, this was an incredibly intense, sensorial and vibrant neighborhood with a large community of sex workers, but also a large LGBT and fetish community with several bars and sex clubs and related shops. And I'm showing you an image of a packed street in the summer before Corona started, with like basically the street being entirely filled with people going around in the red light district. But over the last few years, the authorities, and especially I think part of the city elite, have cultivated this out of control discourse on the red light district. So the rest of the city is becoming this smooth and quiet canals and the 19th century ring around that. And the red light district is a bit of the last bit of unruly urbanism that needs to be incorporated in, let's say, this controlled system of the smooth city. And so the municipality at some point hired this researcher to research the problems in the red light district. And this person made a report, this white, old cis dude, making a report saying, the red light district is an urban jungle and we need to intervene. And then the municipality hired another old white cis dude to actually decide on what we should do, or what the city should do. And he said, like, it's indeed an urban jungle. We need to turn it into a monumental garden. So like using all these colonial tropes and colonial metaphors of the wild that needs to be tamed and needs to be intervened immediately. It needs to be silent, it needs to be smoothened out. And apparently this unruly sexual part of the city needs to be brought back in control. And the mayor has like completely gone along with this kind of discourse. She has proposed to evict all sex workers and probably bring them to this kind of sex hotel or erotic centrum kind of building far out of the city center. And I'm showing you an image of a render made by an architecture office that is a proposal for this new building. It consists, it's a city render consisting of 2 towers in red where like visitors can walk around and visit sex workers in this way. And this architecture firm has not inquired with any sex worker how they would like to see their working environment and how they would like to see their future in the city. And there's of course a long history of such proposals. And I'm quite intrigued by the state brothels in France proposed by Claude Nicolas Ledoux. They were also mentioned in the essay by Paul Preciado. I'm showing you an image of that here. I'm showing you a floor plan of one of these state brothels, obviously in the shape of an erected penis. And of course, this was an attempt to take paid sex outside of the messy urban realm and to make sure to be able to fully control sex workers and their clients and to fully normalize the city and its population. And that's, of course, exactly what is happening in the red light district. It's a similar development. We want to normalize the inner city and make sure that these kind of things not happen anymore. And I'm showing you now an image of what the red light district or the Wallen looked like during Corona. And it's exactly what the city's elite and authorities wanted to be. The Wallen as a controlled, beautiful, quote unquote, perfect village. And to close off, I'm just going to give you a final glitch from the unsmooth city, and that is in no way to romanticize it, but maybe to understand that there were different paths to smooth cities, and there are also potential other futures that we might be able to think of. And I'm showing this image from the Amsterdam archives, and you see sex workers leaning on a wall, and there are like 2 demands written on the wall in graffiti. The first one says, homes not cars, and the second one says, prostitutes demand protection. Sex work is work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rene. Questions? Well, I have a lot in mind, but I don't know where to start.
I was gonna say, like, actually, the last part really reminds me of when you're talking in Cruising Gezi Park, also about the sex workers being pushed out in Istanbul.
I mean, it's a way to smoothen, in quotation, the urban for the authorities, let's say, while they are, you know, there for us to present. So the question is, who are you presenting and who are you presenting for? I mean,
who is the smooth city for in this case? Yeah.
For whom the smooth is? How do you define the smooth city? Wow. It's nearly the same with the, you know, Istanbul, Turkey, the cruising points for sex workers. Now, I mean, they're totally gone around Taksim and Tarlabaşı, the streets. We have few houses, but I mean, let's hope they'll stay. Wow, it's surprisingly, I mean, in Amsterdam it's happening. Wow.
and even here it's also maybe drenched in this idea of humanitarianism, right? So we need to stop human trafficking, we need to help the girls without even asking them what kind of help they want. But also, like, even at some point, one of these guys making these reports said, like, we cannot allow this anymore in the age of Me Too. So actually, weaponizing a feminist movement into actually stigmatizing sex workers. So pretty extreme variety there.
Yeah, on the other way, red light is red light. Yeah, I mean, as more than a coffee shop, like, you know, going to red lights as a tourist. So, I mean, don't they think about even this, you know, red light is a red light and it's there. I mean, it should stay there. I mean, also as another topic. So you know, not the people only, but also, but I'm not sure what they think about, like, smoothing the places and the people, like, wow.
I had a question, because you claim that basically this emergence of the smooth city is sort of rooted in neoliberalism, but wouldn't you also agree that sort of the functional sort of understanding of the city is very much rooted in this Dutch tradition, which you know is sort of, you know, spearheaded by Delft University, Eindhoven, and of course Wageningen, which sort of, you know, lend a lot of their sort of theoretical sort of interpretation of what design is and what a city is in landscape architecture, for example, and, you know, the water engineering has very much shaped also how cities were actually designed and planned. So from this very functionalist, centuries-old tradition, we're now at a stage where, of course, Amsterdam sort of fits within this sort of neoliberal, globalized, sort of new urban development style, which of course can be said to be neoliberal, but then how do you sort of like marry the two?
Thank you. Yeah, very, very good point. But what I tried to show with some of the historical examples, I think there is a long, long history already of like elites and authorities try to smoothen cities and spaces around them. And I think you're totally right. There's very specifically in the Netherlands a long history, of course, in the colonial discourse and in colonial efforts to smoothen spaces here, but also in places around the world. Of course, with these large institutions also very much being related to that. And maybe like if you look at a more recent time, maybe the why I used this neoliberal framework, I think is also maybe to distinguish it, let's say, from the 70s and the 80s, when there was still efforts in the redevelopment of the city, for example, to create social housing that would be equally divided according to a waiting list, basically with like an almost communist kind of social housing system existing until the mid-80s. And right now there is this neoliberal turn from, let's say, the mid-90s is maybe, I think, a very clear break. During the 70s and the 80s, also a lot of people leaving the city, for example. And I think that's right now maybe the biggest turn. So maybe on the short term, maybe that's the change. But I think you're totally right. It would also be interesting to look at a more, at a larger time frame and the historical roots of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Whenever I literally get sad when I listen to things like this, because I think it also reflects my personal history with, when I came to Amsterdam, Valrape was a place when you, the first example that you showed of Oosterpark. Like when I think about how Amsterdam has changed, and hence how this smoothness, I think, also increases this disconnection or alienation or etc. in terms of my relationship to the city, I think can be symbolized in Valrape turning into those blocks of apartments along the canal, and that was just in 2014, right? So it's really just this moment where Spousstraat being gone with the snake house, and not gone, but I mean you have on a Frankrijk t-shirt. I mean it's not gone, but then you're just thinking about the snake house being gone, and what does it mean when I think when you can see that the city is making a specific decision, as you said, about where it should go, right? What does it mean to have query stand in Leidseplein versus have an Apple store? These are just the kind of decisions that are being made over and over and over again by the city. And it's like a big shout. It's a big shout to the people who live in the city that, this is for you or this is not for you. And it's also, I think what's interesting maybe for people like us, it's also about choice, because kind of I can be in any of these places at any moment, but is this where I want to be? And is this how I feel most comfortable? And is this the city that I want without soul? Which I think is kind of what happens. It's like smoothness, then you lose the soul. So I don't know, I'm really thankful for this idea of the smooth city and thinking about it that way, because it's a really
thanks.
Sad.
I had another question for you during your talk, actually, that maybe also relates to this, and that I was wondering, if you would have come here 25 years earlier, and there would be empty buildings and also a diverser population also in the city center, and not this this polished materiality of all these high quality materials on the street, but more, let's say, just the rougher asphalt that used to be everywhere. Would that maybe also have given you a different experience of cycling through the city? I was this different, this also how this smoothing maybe also adds to the alienation that's already there.
And I mean, and maybe you kind of got the answer from what I'm saying. And also I think, and I feel I hate to be one of those persons who's I don't have a question, just have a comment. But this feels like a conversation to have. But it's just, I think what's important in this is it's just showing how it is that I used to also think that it's great to have this beautiful, just sort of everything is perfect kind of place, right? There's this sort of beauty about Amsterdam that there's something to it, But I remember also someone saying to me once when she came from New York, and she's just where is the dirt in Amsterdam? And she's just this place is too clean. And when a place is so clean, you need to figure out what they're doing with the dirt. And I just felt that was just such a fantastic question to ask in that moment. And in that moment, I was also clean is great. But the more you live, the more you realize that, if you keep everything clean, then it also, there's humanity isn't clean. And I think then you sort of really lose this sort of complex human element to a city living,
I can give you a beautiful example of that. I used to live in a housing community on Kinkerstraat in the West, and emerging out of the squatting movement, and on the front door there was a lot of these kind of political stickers, right? And they were there every day, and they were this collection was growing, and it looked very colorful. But one morning all of it was gone, and apparently the municipality started a new zero tolerance policy, especially on Kinkerstraat, to get all the graffiti and stickers out. And we were first surprised, so we started to put some stickers back, but every Monday morning they would be erased again. So there was this team that on every Monday would go through the Kinkerstraat to make sure it would be entirely cleaned for the week. And so there's it even was our own front door. It was not some kind of lamppost or something, but everything was brought back into order, right? To make sure that it would facilitate this upgrading of the neighborhood that is taking place. But maybe it's also good that we shouldn't be, let's not end on a sad note. We're going to be all very sad. I think the smooth city is also very unstable. If there's no money to clean it anymore, or the cleaning is not happening, within a week it will be a very colorful sticker palette. So I think the smooth city is also a matrix of control that can crumble if you don't invest in it, or we choose not to invest in it as a city.
But from a positive note, I did want to ask a question about resistance. But first, just 1 second about this zero tolerance, right? This word for me, I'm just like so stuck on it. It's like buzzing in front of my eyes because it's implying that there is a kind of tolerance that would exist, but at the same time, the idea of zero tolerance kind of it exposes in a way that tolerance as a sort of term or a concept. Yeah. No, but also that it is always already linked to this zero, like somehow, right? Because that it's always already somehow linked to power, obviously. I mean, we know this, but there's something about like using zero tolerance as a slogan throughout the city, where it's just a reminder of this, that tolerance is given to you and taken from you.
Yeah. It's basically like a kind of measure that authorities can like turn up and down a little bit, and there's like the scale goes all the way down to zero.
Yeah,
right?
like Kübra's volume. You know, like it's just like sliding up and down, so much power. But then, speaking of resistance, like when you showed the image of the architectural design, maybe this is a call for, but I wonder, maybe you know better, whether there are any resistance or like proposals of refusal by actual architects. Because these people, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but they also make prisons, they have to, and there's this question also of like giving a little bit more freedom in response to a lack of freedom. Like I'm thinking also of squatting and how it was prohibited, and then you have now anti-squatting, and like you're so happy that you're able to anti-squat, that you're sort of not resisting anymore to even the fact that anti-squat just costs you money and you'll be thrown out at any time, and you're just like a liminal space for capitalism. I just wondered, like, where are the architects resisting? Yeah, and that's very complex because architecture and design is of course about creating something, by creating order out of something that is not there, right? When you build a wall, you're dividing something, and you're like creating a certain order between bodies, for example. So and architecture and design is almost always about that, and it's so ingrained in this profession that it's really hard to kind of switch that. But it's an interesting question, and actually last week there was a conference called Cities for Change in Amsterdam, and I actually organized a small panel also on the smooth city, and I invited 4 architects to come up with plans, like can we actually design against the smooth city, actually? Exactly this question, and I think it was very hesitant discussion. It's a very early, let's say, as a beginning of like a new kind of thinking, maybe. But like one of the projects that I found very interesting was, for example, this architect who said like, okay, we should bring a lot of like empty boats, like maybe the ones that they use for the canal parade to like float these large crowds through the canals, but maybe bring like 400 of them and like just float them everywhere on the Ij, on the canals, and just not fill them up with nice cafes, but maybe like allow people to hang out on them or build something on it, like not clean them 4 times a day, and allow people maybe to maintain them themselves or to claim ownership of it. Now this is our boat. We're gonna like maintain it and regulate access maybe. So it's not all public space for everyone, but it may be, one of these spaces are like regulated by a certain group, and another group is regulating it in a different way and also creating different norms. I thought that was an interesting idea, like to use the water as like adding a lot of space, maybe also solving some of the canal. And I think also this idea of the normative body, like who decides, as Kübra was asking, right? Like who, smooth in whose eyes? It just reminds me also of what you were saying, like sidewalks. They are somehow like a smoothening technology, but sidewalks, when they have like a high curb, are very exclusionary if you're, for example, using a wheelchair. But then something else that popped up in my mind, just to skip ahead at the end of our day, I think Sophie Lewis was recently talking from an ecological perspective about the need to get in touch with destruction. As you were saying also, like human like life is not necessarily clean. And Sophie Lewis really pled for the need to also dare to be destructive. So also when we're talking about care, like how do we care for a space or how do we care for each other, there's also a need to let things die and to allow for that, or to like guide destruction instead of adding always. And that also reminds me a little bit of what you were saying with the architects. Like there's, of course, if this is your job to create things, you're going to continue creating things, but maybe stop creating could also be like stop adding.
Or let things run their course also, maybe, just to start.
Music?
Yay, baby.
Yeah. We're going to continue with our next guest, which is Benjamin Asante. Benjamin and I met, I'm starting every introduction with how we met, in public space, randomly, which is rare in Amsterdam, as René Boer has shown us. Yeah, we just bumped into each other and started talking and continued talking. And here is Benjamin. So Benjamin is a student of political and urban sociology at the London School of Economics and political science also, specializing in critical infrastructure studies. Most of his work centers technologies of deviance in the everyday. And his previous work on water security has brought him to the US, Southern Africa, Singapore, Russia, and Western Europe. What a bio. Benjamin.
I can see the color of your eye in the reflection of the sky. I need a second in the Mile High Club. I've been pushing buttons cause the feelings that I'm missing need a beating, and my hands don't seem to fit these gloves. I think calm and collected, hard and respected, pride is neglected. Those gold chains on your neck look expensive. One shot life, be free from the Brexit.
Hello, dearest Benjamin.
Hello, Kübra.
How are you, darling?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm fine, feeling great.
It was a great dance.
Yeah,
For sure.
really, that's really kicking. Would you like to tell about yourself, darling?
Yeah, so I'm Benjamin Asante. I am a 26-year-old black male, a man with curly hair, 5'9", tall. Yeah. So I'm going to talk today about how to see the street as a walk of shame. So in this talk, I will be centering how we can study the territoriality of intersectional racial hierarchies in streets, and to be exact, in the case of the sidewalk. I'm completely out of breath. The dancing, with all the sitting inside. And so basically, how then the territoriality of these racial hierarchies in streets and the sidewalk, and how we can actually see those, how we can deliberately uncover these territorial hierarchies, which expose walks of shame that are produced in the everyday pedestrian commutes. In the pre-pandemic winter of 2019-2020, I conducted a study employing a walking ethnography and also ethnography in London, where I aimed to academically situate and replicate Hannah Drake's Holding Your Space challenge. That challenge was about asking people of color not to yield space to white people on the sidewalk. This challenge spoke to the everyday experiences of shame where Black, Indigenous, and POC bodies are forced to make way on the sidewalk to white folks, cis men, or relatively lighter-skinned folks. I was alerted to these seemingly sour, grueling, and potentially violent and deeply shaming experiences in 2018, when in conversation with two women, friends of color of mine, I was told that a sidewalk is a battlefield where the violent and shaming experience of daily pedestrian commutes demand space to be constantly yielded to white folks and cis men, whether it's in the Netherlands or any other major global city in the West. This was echoed by Haja Marie Kanu, who profoundly defines this as the politics of pavement. In Haja's article published by Galdem in 2019, a wonderful news outlet that centers the stories of people of color from marginalized genders, Haja explores the following question: have you ever noticed that white people never move out of the way for you on the street? Haja describes that experience, particularly for Black women, are what I define as shaming. Haja writes, "I've been barged into, scowled at, and everything in between for simply deciding not to move out of the way." This is what I call the walk of shame, in light of today's conversation about the architecture of sex and Preciado's lecture published in the Funambulist. The most important takeaway, it's a tricky name, I have to admit. The most important takeaway from my study responds directly to the question I mentioned just now. How can we study the territoriality of racial hierarchies in streets, to be exact in the case of the sidewalk relating to shame? My study establishes a tentative sensibility around reading the sidewalks as assemblages, seeing sidewalks and reading the data collected from sidewalks as assemblages, offers a spatial lens that uncovers how shaming emerges in the territoriality of racial hierarchies paced along the ground. And in order to make sense of sidewalks as places of shame, we need to turn to the sidewalk as a space on the ground. We need to understand what the sidewalk is. Well, Preciado writes so poignantly in the Architecture of Sex essay that architecture always works complicitly with social and institutional techniques. This offers an epistemological framework which can be applied to not only the built environment in and of itself, but as well the empty spaces in between them, streets and specifically sidewalks. Firstly, we can understand streets and sidewalks in terms of a somewhat simplistic social spatial dialectic, where on the one hand, streets are constructed socially through zoning regulations, engineering codes, transportation experts, and mostly other highly specialized skilled experts. And on the other hand, streets do the constructing, where they construct social relations through the daily encounters which they facilitate. Much significance is placed in the latter end of this dialectic, where seminal works by the likes of architect Jan Gill, or scholarly works by Jane Jacobs, or architect and ethnographer Suzanne Hall are seminal in advocating for an urban design tradition to inform public space planning. In particular, delineating the sidewalk as a distinct social and physical space necessitates such an urban design tradition. Why? It's interdisciplinary, draws from engineering, planning, and sociology. It's found in the work by sociologist Mitchell Dunayer. And Dunayer writes so brilliantly that to make sense of the sidewalk requires us to make sense of sidewalks as life. From Dunayer's work, Sidewalk, it reads that, following Jacobs, urban theorists have emphasized what city dwellers in pedestrian areas like Greenwich Village have always known. Sidewalk life is crucial, because the sidewalk is the site where a sense of mutual support must be felt among strangers, if they are to go about their lives together. Where Dunayer highlights that integral to shaping particular sidewalk life are global, national, and some local forces. Well, we have that on one end, and on the other end of this intellectual scholarship, or complementary scholarships, we have a social deterministic view of sidewalks, where the social logic of space, spearheaded by Bill Hillier and Julianne Hansen, regards the street and hence the blocks of streets connecting to other blocks of streets across the city to be prescriptive to the way we navigate and choose our travel plans. If we resist this programmatic reading of streets and human navigation in the city, we also resist the dominant transportation planning regime. We destabilize the very praxis from which sidewalks are conceived, planned, and ultimately built, meaning that efficiency is what governs this way of planning streets, where you go from point A to point B, and just the shortest route or the fastest route will be the one that you choose. Well, emblematic, of course, of this way of thinking about a city and streets and sidewalks is, as was mentioned by René Boer previously, is Haussmann's redesign and redevelopment of Paris, where basically building off the experiences of the French Revolution, Haussmann realized that if you have small and narrow streets, people, protesters, revolters can easily barricade the street, and in a matter of just maybe less than an hour. If you have really wide boulevards, it takes a long time. So the idea was to build long boulevards for quick and efficient deployment of military, but at the same time to place a huge hurdle there for actually protesters to barricade and claim space. So this was even inspired by previous ideas where, for example, in the French tradition, Robespierre, we know from the French Revolution, and Jacobin, actually intended to raze Lyon to the ground because the monarchical architecture he feared would inspire anti-republican sentiments. But of course, as we know now with the Gilets jaunes movement in France, we have seen it unmistakably that people have agency and can challenge a city that's designed to contain them. As such, we can see sidewalks at a granular level as a space conducive to social interactions that exist in social spaces stretching beyond the scale of the US three-city block street model, as do Nair studies, or Haussmann's boulevards, constructing a particular space which can shape how and if mutual support is felt among strangers in these micro-encounters. So, if sidewalks are alive, how do we engage with sidewalks, and specifically as a sociologist? Well, when I was replicating and academically situating Hannah Drake's ostensibly auto-ethnographic experiment of the Holding Your Space Challenge, I chose to truly commit myself to this particular methodology. Auto-ethnographies are, however, though, very controversial within academic scholarship, yet it is important to enable academic debate, to speak to claims and voices of marginalized folks, and attempt to mainstream their voices and identities and subject these experiences to academic interrogation. I decided to embrace a form of self-representation to prevent sensationalism, because, for example, I could just look at others, but as myself, I am a Black man, I can actually occupy that space in a way that Hannah Drake describes it as well. And in doing so, I sustain a space for partial perspectives, as long as I will be accountable throughout my research and hold myself accountable and let myself be held accountable for the betterment of objective scientific inquiry, to the extent that, of course, one can be objective. And that is obviously something that is in constant interrogation and constant communication. That's what academia is for, debate. Traditionally, walking ethnographies finds its origin in urban sociology. And from auto-ethnography, I specifically chose to do a walking ethnography, as this methodology was appropriated by urban sociologists from architects and planners who used this as a surveying technique to understand the city. This reception in urban sociology can be attributed to walking ethnography's spatial, sensory, and temporal registries, enabling me to critically reflect, basically, on what it is to be viewing walking as a mobile and embodied practice. And this demonstrates how it can orient the walker to ordinary life through multiple sensory modes. Whether it's public transit space, the streets, squares, various sensory modes of investigation are considered useful when interaction between strangers are multifaceted and arise from social norms constituted by ethnicity, gender, age, ability, able-bodiedness, age, and many other social identities that are curated in a society we live in, and that are constantly being negotiated and to which individuals conform or resist. So the research question I posed was, does there emerge a racial hierarchy and a territoriality of interactions between non-Black bodies and Black bodies and public transit spaces in London? And that includes also the street. So we have here, so here we have two images of screenshots of Google Maps itineraries. On the left-hand side, we see an itinerary of me doing the walking ethnography, where I moved from Brixton to Embankment. I left at 11:30 a.m. and I arrived at 13 hours and 5 minutes, so 5 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. I'm not a military officer. No, I can't do that. And you can see here on the left-hand side that the image depicts basically the entire stretch of the walk that I did. And I chose specifically Brixton, and because it's one of the neighborhoods that has the highest percentage of Black people living there. It's actually 24% of the population in the borough is Black. And the other location, which you see on the right-hand side, though this is an itinerary of the bus commute that I did, but I also did a walking ethnography there, though the picture doesn't obviously reflect that, which took me less time, more time actually. I left there at 15 minutes past 11 and I arrived there at 14 hours in the afternoon. So I chose Brooklyn as well because 27.2% of the population there is black. So both those boroughs are relatively high in the black population in the City of London, which enables me to basically really have a body in place investigation where I basically, as a black person myself, can try to nestle myself within the experiences of the daily commutes of black people moving across space and in a duration of a few hours toward the city center. Because I chose in both cases Embankment because that's the city center where you have a higher likelihood of more of interracial boundaries being redrawn and negotiated, where there is just simply more racial identities mixing and congregating. And in doing so, I chose not only Brooklyn because it's also black, but also as I was living in Brixton myself, I chose Brooklyn because it's a neighborhood that I actually hadn't been in yet. So what Susan Hall says, slower process of looking is basically facilitated when you are in a place that is unfamiliar to you. You start to look at things more carefully and you notice more details. And that allows me to interrogate my surroundings much more deeply and thoroughly. So what did I do when I actually was doing the walking? I looked for visual cues that I could find in academic literature, in the article published in Galdem by Haja Kanu. So I looked at various different things, such as who sits, who stands, who overtakes someone, who doesn't, who moves out of the way for someone when they are approaching in the opposite direction, or who doesn't. And there's a long list of different visual cues that I looked at. But there were a few that actually sort of, in the end, proved to be much more relevant than others. So in the process of carrying out the walking ethnography, the following visual cues seem to be quite salient. So who apologizes for passing by or through? Who is seen when people walk into each other? And who walks into others? And who anticipates to people approaching them to pass through? So what I could see basically is that very often there were people who immediately apologized if they weren't walking out of the way immediately. Or there were people simply who just walked in a straight line and didn't apologize and didn't even notice the other person. But the actual sort of verbalizing of this maybe sort of physical altercation maybe even is something that really allowed me to very clearly establish that there was a recognition for both parties that there was something that was out of the ordinary or was challenging the status quo of the personal space. So I quote from my paper here that how I orientated myself to all passengers and pedestrians meant that I had to instruct myself to look around me every 30 seconds and especially pay close attention to movements when the bus, rapid transit would approach a stop, when people would take corners. During these moments, people would negotiate. Oh, my apologies. Oh, well, yeah. People would negotiate, conform to, or violate social norms in the transit spaces. These snapshots prove to be most informative in addition to surveying if there is a racial hierarchy in bodies sitting or standing, overtaking, or conforming. And the types of observations that I wrote down in my notebook were things like 3 white men approached, black woman started walking behind her white counterpart. Which I meant by that was that a black woman was walking alongside a white man. 3 white men were walking from the other side in the opposite direction, and the black woman immediately, what I noticed or interpret as such, as anticipating to the 3 white men walking toward her, she moved behind the white man who was walking alongside her initially. So These preliminary findings told me, and I quote again from my paper, in the walking ethnography, there emerge territorial hierarchies within and between non-black and black bodies. These preliminary findings are inconclusive in establishing if these territorial hierarchies exist distinctly between non-black and black bodies. Several forms of territorial hierarchies did emerge when coding data that show that between these two groups, social expectations are not always mutual and are negotiated, adapted, and reinforced in space. In certain instances, priority was given to non-black bodies by black bodies, or taken by non-black bodies, end quote. So it's important here to also not conflate the walk ethnographic observations with forms of racism, as what I could observe were territorial hierarchies that emerged, but whether or not those hierarchies are attributed to racism is obviously a well-established conundrum that exists within academia when studying racism. I personally struggle with sort of conceptualizing this, as it was important for me to not as well sort of overlook the agency that people have themselves who are walking in the street. I could have, for example, relied on interview techniques to ask people how they felt about the experience, or I could record it so I could look back and make sure that what I saw was also indeed what I saw and wasn't formed or shaped by maybe my personal biases as such, but that would violate privacy. So the issue here was definitely that what did become clear that there were racial patterns, whether or not that is indeed what we could say a racial hierarchy paced out in territorial space, in territoriality, and that every interaction and such between non-black bodies and black bodies in public transit spaces are indeed part of a racial hierarchy, is something that needs further investigation and conceptualization in order to find the methodology and the approach to truly substantiate that. So the potentially biased and inductive and hence interpretive nature of this research demands critical interrogation, but at the same time it also demands and I think invites more research that can facilitate this particular way of looking at the world with walking ethnographies to establish how racial hierarchies play out in territoriality and along sidewalks. So I quote again from my paper. In this study, the element of race and hierarchies is negligent unless the relationship between bodily territorial hierarchies and racialization is theoretically and methodologically probed. Primarily, this can be achieved by replicating the study and ensuring the visual cues of territorial hierarchies are appropriately contextualized. Because the visual cues I was looking at may not very well be for expressions or manifestations of racial hierarchies in those particular interactions. Maybe one cue is relevant in one interaction, but it may very well not be in another interaction. Given that I am a master's student, I do not feel qualified to establish that at this point. What basically was an important takeaway from this research was that what has proven valuable was the analytical lens of assemblages. Conceiving territoriality and racialization conjointly assumes an ontological presentation of race is produced in and across space. Agility within academic literature to issues of race, space, and public transit offer unique opportunities to respond to recent political discourse that is expressly exploring the so-called politics of pavement. So I encourage further research. Where assemblages give us a citywide scale of interconnected sidewalk networks, which across space and time have differently located centers of gravity, where distinct micro-encounters emerge within basically the particular bodily interactions, micro-encounters. So that's to say that basically if we think of sidewalks in terms of the framework of the assemblage, we allow ourselves to look at how streets connect to other streets. It allows us to take into account the types of demographic of people, the social identities of people that are encountering each other in the sidewalk. If it's a neighborhood that's predominantly white, then if you look at a granular level and a street block level, then in the street you will not necessarily see particular racial hierarchies if in that case there's no interaction between a non-white body versus a white body. So basically, assemblages allows us to take a citywide understanding of how streets connect to each other and what type of demographic interacts and where, at what particular moment, different types of racial hierarchies supposedly emerge and experiences of shame are calcified and cemented in the social fabric that are produced by these particular assemblages of sidewalks. And assemblage at the same time is important because it takes into account that we are not as humans without agency, that we cannot be diminished to a mere rational thinking actor having only efficiency in mind, because we need to take into account other important demands and needs that we have when we are dwelling the city: joy, safety, community, belonging, citizenship, many more which are very important and inform our pedestrian travel routes. Susan Hall very powerfully throughout her work discusses this, how boundaries of belonging are inextricably related to streets, venues, people surrounding one another. And one particular paper that was very informative was R.T. Rana's paper from 2020 that teaches us to discern between assemblages of belonging, where distinct assemblages are of hierarchies of citizenship and belonging emerge across the urban landscape. And that's to say that in R.T. Ratna's research, there was an effort to foreground basically the different types of assemblages, where in certain parts of the city, different types of hierarchies of citizenship were produced, and that was in part shaped by, indeed, the types of interactions that were facilitated by the actual built environment. So my research hinted at a conclusion as well, that basically there were, across these different boroughs, different types of racial hierarchies, where, for example, well, there wasn't necessarily a difference in terms of the point of departure. So where started from Brixton and Brockley, there wasn't necessarily a difference there. But as we move closer to the city center and the racial mix of people changed, but also the pace of the city changed. People were there to work, to have particular activities that demanded a different pace in the city. I noticed that there were different hierarchies emerging, where, for example, black bodies were under more pressure to negotiate or conform to dominant non-black bodies closer to the city center than in Brockley or Brixton. So I think what is very important here is to understand that ultimately, walking ethnographies of sidewalk assemblages can deepen our understanding of shameful aspects to the sidewalk life. Anthropologist Lan Shanshan writes that such walking ethnographies are a crucial domain in examining the racialization of space, the making and unmaking of interracial boundaries, and the performance of gendered and racialized stereotypes in daily life settings. And I want to make a quick shift to Amsterdam. Right. So here we see a Google Maps screenshot, which centers in the very center of the map De School, which is a former techno club nightlife venue, the most popular in the Netherlands and one of the most popular in Europe. We can see that it's basically situated on the edge of the city at a juncture where different transportation lines converge, connecting through different assemblages, connecting very different set of individuals. We can only start to wonder, perhaps, interpretively together, what distinct sidewalk assemblages needed to be navigated by different demographics to access the most popular and sought-after popular nightlife venue in Amsterdam. And perhaps as well what shame was discursively produced along the way. I would like to encourage people to traverse from their home locations to the school and be attentive to the routine bodily practices that emerge on the sidewalk across different areas of the city, where what Sheng Yan writes, open up series of spaces for critical reflections on what constitutes urban life in cities, prompting one to imagine how we ought to design sidewalks differently and designate particular venues across the city within assemblages which are conducive to mutual support among strangers instead of shame. Ending with de Sourteau's work in mind, walking can be a form of resistance to routine of modern life. And if we ought to elevate our agency as urban dwellers, we need to claim ability to not be merely responsive to restrictions the built environment imposes, but have strategic capability to navigate ourselves through the city with ease and purpose. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes.
What is an assemblage?
Yeah.
It's funny. I was just I was in a PhD project where everything was about assemblages, or not mine, but the sister project. So I feel like I know all about assemblage.
Oh, okay.
But I was really curious actually about going back to the autoethnography aspect of it, and just thinking then about your personal experience walking through the city. What did you how did you deal with these interactions and sort of maybe the racialized interactions as well?
Yeah, so when I presented this research project to my professor, I was told that it can be very well a very challenging experience because it could be, for me personally, very uncomfortable. Being mindful of the fact that I, as a black man, cis man, navigate these spaces in a particular way where, of course, I am racialized in particular situations and spaces in various different ways that are related to anti-black racism. So when deciding on doing an autoethnography, I was sort of like try to actually highlight for myself all these visual cues that maybe I have myself internalized and conditioned to look at, and use that as an actual sort of faculty of academic insight to actually see and observe. You know, I mean, work by Hill Collins, for example, is beautiful as, you know, like as an insider's perspective. I can see things that maybe others don't. And that was also sort of the academic context in which the class in which I wrote this was placed in. So I really tried to elevate actually maybe my own experiences and learn from them and sort of see them as an instructive maybe way of going about doing this. But at the same time, as I said as well, like during my talk, there is not, to this day, a body of literature that sort of very extensively outlines what visual cues and what maybe sets of visual cues actually make up a racial hierarchy in space. So the territoriality of racial hierarchies is in that sense understudied. So I also, admittedly, like, thought of different visual cues from literature, from myself, and from articles that I could find that sort of related to this. I mean, queer and feminist scholarship definitely offers a lot of help and support in sort of seeing territoriality in public space as something safe, as unsafe. But it was challenging because how do I discern from what I personally maybe perceive to be racist and what actually then we could, let's say, academically claim to be a visual cue for the territoriality of racial hierarchies. So I sort of oscillating between the two and just said more research has to be done as I a knowing of what that is. And that requires more people to engage with this type of research, to actually establish that. And that's also why I said debate. It's important to academia because we need more people and more voices and perspective to really sort of tease out what those visual cues can be, or if maybe even we need to look at visual cues, because it's also an ideal type is also a very sort of misleading, maybe, way of analyzing the social world. Yeah. Thank you.
Something?
Yeah, of course.
During your talk, I was thinking a lot about a solution that is often offered in response to the smooth city. For example, like the pavements and public space should not just be designed by one authority, but we should allow different people to intervene and also co-design public space. And we should allow confrontations to happen and conflicts in how people organize the pavement and public space. But like listening to you, I'm also, of course, reminded of the fact of the politics that play out in the pavement and the problematic dimensions in that. So I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of like letting go in public space, also in terms of design. So like, what would happen if like different kind of groups or people could also collectively, add things to public space and change it and redesign it, right. And how would that relate to your research?
Good question. Thank you. Yeah, I think if we think of sort of democratizing urban planning and these types of initiatives, then it's obviously very important to sort of first acknowledge who are the ones who are sort of initiating this project, you know, who is facilitating and the conversations between different stakeholders, and how is that process actually managed. And I think municipalities aren't in and of itself, I think, the best players to actually initiate this. What I, particularly in London, could observe is that there's a lot of conversation about, you know, DIY spaces, and there are many DIY spaces, but much more communitarian approach to space, where different, let's say, neighborhoods or boroughs, or, well, boroughs would be, the scale would already be too large, so let's say neighborhoods or street blocks would be basically managed and maintained and designed, let's say, then by one community. So I don't think it's necessarily, the question should be how can we integrate all those different demands and interests, but how can we ensure, as you as well in your talk hinted at with the different boats scattered around the city, where I think it's okay to have different spaces that are owned and maintained by a particular group of people who decide to live jointly, which needs to be complementary to other communities. But I think it's okay to see this type of conflict and this sort of disarray of different interpretations of how the sidewalk should look like. But then also, as I'm saying in my talk as well, we should indeed think about what type of assemblages of the social fabric exist in particular parts of the city. So we need to make sure that you don't need to, let's say, then enter maybe a different community to actually go do your groceries. And I'm not saying that the entire city should be sort of self-isolated, sort of islands of different communities, but to some extent, I think that can be allowed. And I think that's democracy, I think, can function well when people can preserve their own interests and needs without those harming and injuring and oppressing others.
Wow. Let's continue these threads of thought with our next speaker. I have so many thoughts also in relationship to Tracy Ann's talk, and thinking between when you said, Tracy Ann, oh no, let me not intellectualize but stay with the feeling. There's so many different sort of threads also between your path through the city and Benjamin's path through the city, and questioning, maybe even mapping, right? What does this mean to map? Especially having the Google Maps image with us. But I started talking to save time, and now I'm talking and taking time. So let's continue with and give you another round of applause. Thank you so much. now we're continuing with our next guest, Jeanette Chedda. Jeanette is with us mentally for the whole day, but just arrived, not just as a surprise, but also because, of course, time is not always accessible to everybody, because Jeanette has a regular job, and of course we're filming during the day. So we're really happy that Jeanette is now with us. And Jeanette Chedda and I, we met each other, I think, at the book presentation of Clarice Gargar, which was a great party, also a bit pre-COVID. And since then, I've been following Jeanette's work with so much admiration for your work as an electoral candidate for the political party Bijeen. But you're also one of the co-founders of Bijeen Delft. Yes, yeah. I was like, no, but you didn't know what you co-founded, but you co-founded, yeah. The founder of Bijeen Delft, you should claim that, yeah, true. The founder of Bijeen Delft, and also Jeanette is an author. You can read Chedda's work in De Goede Immigrant, Damn Honey, and Damn Horny. Shall we welcome you to the stage?
Picturing you naked, I'm a little faded. You look like a fucking painting. Big doe eyes, amazing. She's everything I've been praying. My heart palpitation. She looks like the type to break it. Me and your girlfriend playing dress up at my house. I gave your girlfriend cunnilingus on my couch. She cute, kawaii, hentai boobies that excites me. I think she really politely, can I?
How are you, dear?
It's so warm
We just danced. We just danced.
It's so warm today. I'm good, thanks.
Welcome,
Thank
darling.
you.
It's
Thank you.
so good, lovely to see you here.
I'm so very happy to meet you.
Would you like to tell about yourself?
I am Jeanette Chedda. I'm 37 years old, and I identify. I refer to myself as proud disabled woman of color.
Yeah, proudly.
So that's me.
So the stage is yours, darling.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Thank you.
So that I'm not in your image.
Okay. Whew. So I wrote a little thing with the title, A Lifetime of Inaccessibility and the Violent Effects on Bonding and Intimacy. Growing up in an inaccessible society, I don't think I remember ever talking about this or thinking about the violent effects it had until I had a conversation with someone about how they made friends for life while in university. We were talking about how she went to events, bars, clubs, and how those experiences made her friends and connections for life. In this conversation, where I told this person about how I could never go out with my peers or wasn't even invited because I couldn't get into bars, clubs, or places they went to. Sometimes it was the physical accessibility, and sometimes they were too awkward about me being disabled. Because all my life people have been awkward when seeing me or interacting with me because I'm disabled. When I was done talking, she paused. She looked at me with a certain look, and then she started to reflect on how deeply this must have affected my life and my friendships over the years, and how important the friends and connections she made then are still important in her life. In that reflection, it dawned on me, wow, I never realized this before. Until that moment when this person reflected on the effect of the inaccessibility of this society, I have been blaming myself. And I realized something else. I never got over the fact that I always felt bad when I saw pictures of friend groups on social media. Now I knew why I felt bad. It is because deep inside I wished I had those friend groups too. I was a little jealous. And I was angry because I didn't have those friends. I was angry because I blamed myself. I blamed myself for being disabled. Let me take you back to where it all began, because that was way earlier in life. I grew up with a brother who was 3 years younger than me. He went to preschool in the same street we lived on. I didn't. I had to go to a separate school with all the disabled kids. Special school. Special. It was a 30-minute drive. I didn't realize it then because I thought it was special. But now I know how violent it was on my bonding and intimacy. It was mostly a practical thing, but it was a thing with major consequences. I did not have the same friends as my brother in the same street. He played with his friends outside. I did not. I didn't know them. My friends from special school lived all over the city, and maybe once a year on my birthday, my friends came over to my house. And if everything worked out, more than once a year, just to play. Or when I was invited for a birthday or to play. I saw my friends at school, but summer vacation was very lonely. I didn't run into my friends because they didn't live in the same street. I just saw them in school. I didn't make any long-term, lasting friendships. I wished I went to the same school as my brother. It would have helped me bond with my brother too. I left the special school in the second year of high school. I wish I left earlier. In the regular high school I went to, I started in the second year. I adapted quickly, thank goodness. I made friends. I bonded lightly. I looked up to the girls. We hang out. We had adventures. But I was also jealous because all of the attention they got from the boys and all the stories they told about what they experienced with boys. They got crushes. I got crushes. They got boyfriends. I didn't. They explored their sexuality. I didn't. I wish boys weren't ashamed for being seen with me. In high school, I couldn't attend gym class. The school didn't adapt gym class so I could participate. They made me wait in the hallway for those hours to do homework. I blame myself for not being able to participate. I blame myself for being disabled. I wish the school adapted gym class so I could play with the kids too. Even though I adapted quickly, after school, all the kids took public transportation together to go home. I couldn't. I had separate transportation because of my wheelchair. Public transportation when I was a kid was not accessible at all. I wish it was so I could go home with them and have more adventures. High school. I did not make long-lasting friendships. Secondary education. I started my new school in a mostly white class. The white kids came from the same high school, so they were already friends. They seemed rich too. It was hard to connect with them because they weren't very open to it. And they made it very clear too. It made me sad. I wasn't really aware at the time of any socio-economic implication or racial implication. I wasn't aware of that all. I wasn't aware of that at all. I just did what I had to do. Go to class, took tests, got my diploma. In those years, I made one long-lasting friendship. I wish I had been in the other class where whiteness wasn't omnipresent, upheld, and reinforced. Going back to where I started in this story, university. I did not have the stereotypical student life as we know it. I was not part of any study association. I did not have roommates. I did not go out all night. I was not dating. I did not explore my sexuality because boys were still ashamed of being seen with me. I did not participate in any of that student life except for the academics. In university, I did have fun though. I connected more than I did in all the other years before, but I did not make friends for life. I wish that stereotypical student life was more open to disabled people. I have been looking to society from the outside most of my life. I did not realize it then, but I realize it now. Shout out to the disabled activists and allies. I don't have to blame myself for being disabled. I don't have to blame myself for being disabled. I don't have to blame myself for being disabled. I have this metaphor to get a glimpse of how it feels to always being on the outside of society looking in. Try to imagine. Maybe close your eyes. Ready? Remember when you were about to go to the amusement park with your friends? Imagine the excitement you felt when you were on your way. Imagine the fun you had going there. Imagine the anticipation while you were on your way with your friends. You were ready. Sunscreen, drinks, candy, and snacks in your backpack. You were ready to go have fun all day with your friends. You're almost there. You're so excited. You can't wait to arrive. And then you arrive. Imagine walking towards the park. You hear the music. You feel your heart beating faster. You smell the sweet scent of cotton candy and you can't wait to buy some. You are going towards the gates of the amusement park. Can you envision it? You are finally here. And then you get stuck. You are not able to get in because you didn't fit through the gates. You try, you try, you try, and you try again. But there's no way of getting in and you are stuck looking through the fence. Now you're looking through the fence, seeing all those people and your friends go in. You are looking at all those people having the most amazing time. But you can't get in. Let it sink in. What do you feel? Try to feel. What do you feel? This is how I feel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
If I can ask, what were your initial thoughts about sharing about your life here today, at this venue, at this place, in the context of the architecture of sex? Was it a very disturbing confrontation, or did it feel inviting, or what did you feel about that, or think about that?
First of all, I am really happy to have gotten this opportunity to explore this subject for me more, because as in the first part of my talk, I referenced to that I couldn't remember when I ever talked about this subject. So in the bigger picture, in the emancipation of disabled people in this society, we're still at the stage of proving our humanity. So I'm really happy to like explore this, to be honest. I don't know if this gives answer to your question, but
thank you.
And I already knew I would cry. So this is kind of, I don't know, healing, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I cannot. This is just the phase we're in.
Yeah.
We're still just here.
Thank you so much. Also because just I think it's this idea also, I think just in kind of relating to what you're just saying, like we're actually pushing yourself to really dig deep into how you're feeling and to center that feeling rather than centering how you think you should feel. Like it leads to like, yeah, kind of a moment of, as you're saying, healing for you, but also for us, kind of like this level of like understanding and an entry that I think, because a lot of persons don't talk from that perspective, you don't, you know, I mean, that it sounds, now I'm centering myself, but I think I just wanted to say like, really thank you for like being so, so open and kind of about your own feelings, which I think allows so many like entry points of relations, like how you can be like, I see that, like when you're talking about the awkwardness of, you know, of being like, it's this way in which you're like, I'm just me, and the awkwardness is on your side, but then also kind of being able to realize that this is not your fault, but the other person's fault for actually being awkward around you, but you're always having to navigate like these awkward situations. And again, it's not a question, I just wanted to say like, yeah, thanks for just kind of, and maybe I do have a question, and maybe it's just to elaborate, but I really enjoyed how you kind of enjoyed in a very grounding, also, yeah, emotional way, but how you talk also about, you know, being a woman of color and this intersection of like attractiveness and with men, or you're not even attractiveness, but men wanting to be seen versus also having to deal with white classmates and then being disabled, and how you put all of them in together. And I was wondering if you could kind of like also talk a little bit more about how all of these things kind of add on each other and build, yeah.
Well, I have a lot to say about that, I think, but I'm also processing the talk I just had. When I said I wasn't really aware of the socio-economic and also the racial implications of me being a disabled woman of color, I really didn't realize. I can now reflect back on my life and then see what was happening from memory. But fairly recently, like a few years ago, until I think 2012, I really ignored big parts of my identity. So I didn't want to be disabled, I didn't want to be a woman of color. I really tried to like just participate in this society by getting all the material things I thought would help me in this world. But then I got to the point that I got all those material things, like an education and I was living on my own. I had a car. So all those material things were said. I had a job. And then I still didn't feel happy. So that was the point where I was forced to really look into the acceptance of my disabled part of my identity. So with that, a lot of things have changed for me internally, but also how I look at myself in the world, because the thing was, I was ashamed of my disability because our society learns disabled people that there's something wrong with you when you have a disability. So I really internalized all those negative ideas and stereotypes about myself. And then, because in this world we also look at disabled people from a medical perspective, like we see a disabled people and we want to fix them. So that was in my head a lot, and then I changed the whole view I had on looking at someone with a disability through a social perspective. And that social perspective was a big load off my shoulders, because the social perspective learns us that the problem is not within the disability of that person, but in society. The society isn't accessible for disabled people to participate. And that's where we need to fix stuff, not with the disability. And when I realized that switch in my head, that was a big moment, and brought a big weight off my shoulders. And then later on, the implications of me being a woman of color came along. The awareness of what that meant for me in this society. So it's still in progress, I guess.
Thanks.
So that's it.
I would maybe have a question around both the architecture and the sex. So 2 questions. First of all, thank you so much. As Tracy-Ann was saying, right, your skill of putting us in our bodies, whichever body you might be in at this moment, was quite extraordinary as a narrator. So thank you for that. But also on a personal level, I was immediately thrown back to a few years in my life that I used a wheelchair. Funnily enough, also going to a theme park. The one time that I went to Disney World was when I was using a wheelchair. And I remember it so well, not just because there's many pictures of me in Disney World, but also because for each ride, they would let me go first. So basically I could skip the line, although I had to prove that I could walk a few steps in case there was like an emergency, the ride would get stuck, for example. So first of all, you had a line of people watching you walk, and there was so much, speaking of the walk of shame, there was so much feeling around that where you could feel people looking at you like, oh, this person can go first, but they can walk. So what, you know, like this sort of feeling. But that's just me sharing that personal memory, but also it made me think a lot about this question of accommodation. Like, that you can go first, it's nice if you're in a rush. But also thinking back about your talk in terms of time, and also what you said, Benjamin, about efficiency, this expectation of efficiency. So like if we take that away, right? And we take away this idea that, oh, I want to get to the line first. Because actually, like you're saying, the violent effects on intimacy and bonding are that I'm not in the line. I'm not meeting people in a line. And it just made me think so much about accommodation as a false fucking notion of inclusive architecture, right? Like accommodation being the ramp that we put in for a chair, for a stair, sorry. Instead of redesigning the space fully. And that brings me to the question of if you have a dream architecture, just thinking maybe of the street that you currently live, what would it look like?
I see the skipping in line as reparations, to be honest.
Yeah.
That's just what I was thinking when you were talking. For all the times everything cost a lot more time than anyway. But I think that's a really difficult question you're asking me because yeah, I think that's a difficult question and I don't know if I have the answer to it. Because to me it would seem very boring, but I really love concrete. So I can just roll away. From my car to this museum was freaking hell. But if it was paved with concrete, then I would roll in, right? But on the other hand, it's, yeah, not very appealing, right? And I do love nature and to live in a green area. I fortunately live in a green area, so I'm very happy about that. So I wouldn't want to see that all gone for concrete. So I have to explore that more. I really don't know.
Second question about sex was that when you sent the when you shared the Damn Horny text, which is a erotic fantasy story, or not a fantasy maybe, but it could be read as, you sent me the story and you sent a trigger warning accompanying saying, trigger warning, heterosexual sex. And I wanted to ask you, like, how do you relate your exploration currently with sexuality also to queerness? And I mean the public exploration with sexuality, like speaking about it, etc.
I still find it awkward, but I've been taking steps in recent years, with the biggest step writing this story for Damn Horny. And since I found the disabled Dutch activist community, for the first time in my life, I felt at home. So the Dutch disabled activist community for me is really a space where I'm celebrated, where I'm supported, and where I feel at home. People see me for who I am and what I stand for. And since I've met this community, I've been feeling more free to explore these sides of me that I firstly didn't even imagine. So a part of feeling at home finally after 30-something years, I'm just at the beginning of that exploration, to be honest. So a lot of things that I've been experiencing lately from being a part of that community just started. So I'm still in the process of exploring, and I'm seeing the steps I'm making in the bigger picture. So yeah, I'm very excited, to be honest. But because it also brought me here and in contact with people like you. So I'm exploring it. That's my answer, I guess.
So we ended with Jeanette Chedda saying that finding community has been also helping in exploring sexuality. And speaking about community, we're now going to talk about family abolition. With each speaker, I say how I first met them. I have never met Sophie Lewis, unfortunately, but I did encounter Sophie Lewis's work through actually the work of Kim Tauber, an indigenous scholar working on science and technology and also working on decolonial sexualities. And Kim Tauber and I have been corresponding since the start of COVID, actually, thinking about like how could sexualities, but also of course kin, look different, especially with this moment where we're locked inside the house. Or we're presumably locked inside the house. And this is something that Sophie Lewis has been writing about a lot. And her book, I have it here, Full Surrogacy Now. It's really amazing. I could definitely recommend it. Speaking about care communism, but also they post this idea of where the end of capitalism is maybe difficult to imagine, but it might be even more difficult to imagine the end of the family.
Cheers, darling! Sophie, would you like to tell us how you look now? Describe.
How I look?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a sort of slightly femme of center, ginger, non-binary person wearing a very, very old synthetic flowered red and black and white dress that I've owned since I was 10 years old. And I'm sitting on my couch. And the lighting is kind of, I realize, a bit strange. Even though it's day, I have this other light. I have shadows projecting onto the wall as I move my hand.
I love the shadows. Slay to the description. Mark is on you.
Thank you. Greetings, friends, comrades. Yeah, it's a rainy morning in the aftermath of a dramatic thunderstorm. On the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape people, known as Philadelphia, on Turtle Island, North America. And I'm so grateful to Simone for including me and supporting my small contribution to this program. I'm grateful to Rowan and all of you. I'm excited to meet Kübra in particular, whose playlist I really enjoyed and whose Gezi Park fabulations I found so inspiring. I'm envious of those of you who get to be part of this in person, including in this space, these cutely lit catacombs. Early on in the pandemic, I actually had this exciting and then tragically cancelled appointment to travel to the Pompidou Center in Paris to talk to Paul Preciado about topics like this, about including linking it to the contemporary politics of abortion and gestational labor, my concept of amniotechnics, and the book that Simone kindly brandished at you, the Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family hardback. It's coming out in paperback next month. And so this Preciado-inspired symposium today is perhaps, in my mind, part of the end of the postponement of that conversation from last year. So much of my thinking over the past 5 years has had to do with the way the waged commercial gestational workplace has been constructed as distinct from, and in fact, invisibilizing of, the unwaged gestational workplace, also known as the home. And it has, as I sort of freely reflect in some of my more recent essays, definitely been shaped by my own traumatic experience of the private nuclear household. And as I learned even more recently, actually of birthing labor as the gestatee rather than gestator. My mother died in November 2019 and left behind this typewritten account of what it was like to actually birth me at the age of 41. And we both nearly died. Like many refugees from the private nuclear household, I'm queer and non-monogamous and a survivor, and also more than capable of seeing that my experience is not universal. And there are many so-called biological families in which liberatory care and love do, in fact, flourish. And the point of, me and my comrades' critique of the family is a particularist universalism, or universalism from below, that targets simply the organized scarcity that is the private nuclear household. It's not about asserting that xenofamiliality, right, or queer kinship is somehow always superior to biofamilially conceptualized bonds. So as someone who trained for their PhD as a human geographer, but who is and always has been a kind of cultural critic, always at the same time as, and technically prior to doing geography, and being always an omnivorous, anti-disciplinary kind of humanities scholar who sort of writes and reads and thinks in the same critically utopian way, regardless of whether their degree is supposed to be in geography or literature or politics or environmental policy. I'm sort of formally untrained in architectural matters, but really fascinated by the question of architecture. And, for example, really enamored of semi-forgotten urban planning projects like Dolores Hayden's quote-unquote feminist city, for example, and Hayden's context more generally of a whole ecology of 70s women's and gay and children's liberationists who suggested, for instance, not only that children should belong to no one but themselves, to quote the US-based Sisterhood of Black Single Mothers, but that no single dwelling should have a kitchen because cooking should never be private. I realize actually that, the disembodied, dislocated place of Zoom is a strange kind of place to be talking about this. The kinds of histories of family abolitionism that are so unfamiliar in the US may in fact be more familiar to people in Amsterdam, which has a much more recent history of utopian communes and squatting and so on. I don't know how to gauge that. So you will tell me. But yeah, so Dolores Hayden is one of my reference points and her feminist city blueprints, but going much, much further back in time, 9,000 years, in fact. I'm curious, for example, about Çatalhöyük, which was a very large Neolithic and Chalcolithic proto-city settlement in central Anatolia. And as the artist Nazıl Gürlek Hodder tells me, this 9,000-year-old civilization had no family structure at all. all of the children and the adult members of the society formed households in a mixed manner, independent of genetic affiliation. But to step back for a second and define terms a little bit, family abolition, what is that? As some of you, I think, know, I am a writer and freelance para-academic strongly associated with this small revival that has taken place over the past 5 years or so, at least in the left Anglosphere, but a little bit beyond, in this concept of the abolition of the family, which was, of course, one of the so-called infamous proposals of the communists, as Marx and Engels wrote in their manifesto, and a proposal which would then be fleshed out by Bolshevik leaders like Alexandra Kollontai, but which also had earlier precedents and even architectural blueprints already in the writings of the inventor of the word feminism, for example, Charles Fourier. And the vision of family abolitionist utopian socialism outlined by Fourier and then experimentally practiced thereafter for some time by so-called Fourieristes all over the world was, designed to be housed and produced through massive living complexes called phalansteries or phalanstères. And its sociality was imagined as revolving fairly centrally around transgenerational orgies. And that's a theme which recurs, funnily enough, in the vision of post-gender, post-family communism imagined by the American radical Shuli Firestone in the final chapter of her 1970 manifesto, The Dialectic of Sex. And in that milieu in which Firestone was existing, there were all kinds of queer revolutionaries, Chicanx, Black, and Indigenous, including doing a domestic care worker-led and welfare recipient-led struggle in and against the organization of scarcity that is the private nuclear household imagined as biological. But, ever since that moment, and I think it can never be said enough that the long 60s was a defeat, right? A lot was possible then, and a lot has been purposively forgotten in the wake of the defeat. We lost is the other way of simply saying it, right? And ever since Firestone and her comrades, the vast majority of Western feminists and leftists have tried to sort of walk back the demand to abolish the family, which is to say to fully deprivatize care. And we have hastened to reassure our distressed and outraged audiences that we are not anti-family. In fact, we want more family, not less. And perhaps that capitulation, that sort of rhetorical sleight of hand is understandable, because after all, distinguishing families from the family is an unfamiliar maneuver nowadays. Families may be where capitalism gets resuscitated every day for free, and where the vast majority of queer-phobic and sexualized violence takes place. But they are also often the only protections against racism and alienation and the police that many people have. To criticize the family in the contemporary political landscape is to be understood as nihilistically anti-relational at best, and at worst, anti-Black, presumably because, non-white groups and Black populations in general are sort of supposedly more dedicated to or dependent upon family than white. And it's true that the regulatory fantasy of the nuclear family is upheld zealously, even religiously, as a cultural value by almost every existing group, and certain indigenous people are a notable exception to this. But that doesn't mean that the family is not structurally implicated in ethnic and class hierarchies. Far from just being harmful to women and children. The family as such, with its exclusions, extortions, and arbitrary rationings of care, is spiritually deleterious for all, but it actually has especially and materially lethal consequences for Black and brown, immigrant, indigenous, poor and working class, queer, trans, feminized, sex working, and gender non-conforming people whose needs, desires, and modes of survival it pathologizes and devalues. So as I see it, the privatization of care into the family household, like the state-imposed norms of the couple form and the biogenetic model for registering rights and responsibilities over children, has to be seen as a continuation of the older eugenic project of advancing whiteness and producing a well-ordered, productive labor force. And understanding this might help us see through the false universalism of family values, where, for example, the American state purports to stand for keeping families together, which is a flawed principle in itself, especially for queer youth whose biological kin often want to kill them, but then tortures and rips apart the non-white family at the border.
With the coronavirus lockdown, it is my hope that the realities of the human body's interconnectedness and private property's deathliness became inescapable for new tranches of humanity. Doctors in the before time were already known on occasion to prescribe food, money, companionship, abuse-free shelter, or a holiday from housewifehood to their patients. In 2020, however, the concepts of reproductive justice, family inequality, compulsory domesticity, and the quote-unquote right to the city took on even more force as officials instructed populations to maintain social distancing from everyone except family, and to quote-unquote shelter in place. In whose place? Your families. Abusers everywhere have been battering and molesting their partners and young relatives in the privacy of their properties with increased impunity, since it has been more difficult than ever, physically and financially, to flee a home. As with AIDS in the 1980s, the itinerant houseless, the sexually deviant, notably today the figure of the transgender child, and the unconventionally housed, are once again the object of public suspicion. Meanwhile, a huge proportion of households in the United States and elsewhere are either crowded or under-inhabited, even empty. The pathways of love and care labor, paid and unpaid, running between these two houses, were they to be diagrammed, would resemble an impenetrable web. With urban movement so constrained, the already desperately limited legal frameworks of marital union and biogenetic next of kin, which are used to gatekeep hospital visits and triage the dead, to determine custody, calculate life insurance, and allocate inheritance, started to really strain at the seams. Judging simply by the kinds of emails I got from magazine editors whose tone toward family abolition changed significantly, people could now appreciate more keenly that there is no justice in those rules which keep chosen kin from seeing one another, treat children like property, and shore up wealth or poverty within a class, which is not to say there is a quick fix. What we can semi-confidently observe is that the interruption of global supply chains in the care and service economies has been rubbing the classed and racialized character of capitalism's division of reproductive labor in the global bourgeoisie's unwilling face. What to do? For family abolition, for gender liberation, capitalism must fall. Collective pleasure will not, unfortunately, make it fall alone. But collective pleasure is a component of revolutionary practice that much of the contemporary left, such as it still exists, tattered and weak, in the US, at least, really dismisses and overlooks, arguably even more so than it did in the past. And that's part of why I'm so glad to see the Amsterdam Museum hosting this symposium on the architecture of sex. In 1987, the gay revolutionary Douglas Crimp published the essay How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic. The epidemic in question being, of course, not COVID, but another spikily haloed virus, HIV. And that essay expresses the wisdom, epidemiological expertise, and hard-fought shamelessness of the countless militant lesbians and gays who refused to be blackmailed by the state into monogamy, into abstinence, or a work ethic, and who invented safe sex as the bedrock of their promiscuous culture long before AIDS. And following Crimp, it is my view that one of the many crimes of capitalism's terraformers, besides incubating coronaviruses by destroying biodiversity, is their theft of untold proletarian sex hours via the imposition of work and the concomitant disappearance from history of gigawatts of cumulative erotic bliss. The denial of pleasure to populations is a grave historic harm, and the denial by some leftists of the centrality of pleasure to liberation struggles is a correspondingly serious error. If any one group in America possesses an established practice of informal contact tracing, for STI exposure, for example, it is, of course, promiscuous, self-respecting queers for whom sex and the erotic are inextricable aspects of how they relate to the world. In my essay, Collective Turnoff, published at Mal Journal, I concluded on a utopian note. Fighting against the policing and regulation of what Jordi Rosenberg calls our constitutive porosity means figuring out how we will manifest architecturally and ecologically biomes conducive to bathing aimlessly and celebrating our collective permeability and care neediness on a mass scale. Speaking optimistically, the vapor-containing techniques of masking up and keeping a 6-foot distance from one another's bodies might paradoxically prove to have been wonderful popular primers, not only in solidarity and epidemiological consciousness, but also, therefore, in tenderness. And as we abolish the capitalist logic of work and of obligatory enjoyment, we will instantiate the conditions of possibility for collective eros and collective living. We will, children and non-children alike, as survivors of the old regime of sexual violence, design whole cities full of comforting biotic infrastructure, whole continents adorned from coast to coast with spaces of thrilling safety, mushroom glades, therapy marquees, doula grottos, patient-led free clinics, swimming holes, napping palaces, drop-in centres, temples for public weeping, bathhouses, multi-generational creches, polymorphously perverse aquifers, people's banquet halls, multi-species library sensoriums, train compartments that get you off, laundrettes that offer to fist you, collective houses that promote well-being, dance halls that promote bliss, massage coliseums, and pleasure pavilions. Like sexual freedom, children's liberation and the abolition of the private nuclear household used to be central problems of anti-capitalist thought and practice. As I say, the family as a technology for privatizing life's work and naturalizing care scarcity was once a prime target of socialist rhetoric about 50 years ago, and it was arguably the prime object of feminist and queer critique. Feminism identifying it as a thief of love's labors, a social factory, and queer liberationists identifying it as a site of violence and death. I believe the time is right for us to make this so again. Why should all housing, healthcare, elder care, childcare and education be universally free, decommodified, and democratically run? Not least because we all deserve, as both providers and beneficiaries of these things, more than the lottery that is family. We deserve a feminist city, as utopian geographers once called it. We deserve an end to birth certificates, surnames, inheritance, private insurance, and all privileges afforded by legal marriage. These are some of the ideas that could help our racially and class stratified societies transform into comradely ones, such that they no longer need nor even understand the bizarre premise of the family. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie Lewis. Thank you so much, Amsterdam Museum, Rowan and Esme and Emma. Thank you so much for all the work that goes in behind the scenes, as well as the crew. But of course, thank you so much to the lovely, 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 lovely cast. Tracy and Miko, René Boer. I was expecting like a song that comes up. Kübra! Benjamin Asante, and Jeanette Chida, and of course, from afar, Sophie Lewis. And thank you for watching.
And Simone.
This is the song I did last year for Istanbul Pride with Mixer.